we are looking at the wellbeing journey. We've been going through this, and many of our life groups have been looking after this. And we're coming now to relational well-being. And in some ways, of course, I guess many of us would be thinking, do we really need this? Because we've got all our relationships sorted, haven't we? Or maybe not. I'll let you into a little secret. Every now and again in the BEC office, the phrase is heard, people. People, eh? Now, obviously, our staff would not talk about our wonderful BEC members like that. I'm sure it's other people we're talking about. But it is the case, isn't it, that in the words of A Tale of Two Cities, if you could put the next slide up, Rich, thanks. This is a picture of a Dirk Bogarde in the 1950s, Tale of Two Cities, the book that begins, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And relationships can be a bit like that, can't they? They can be the best of times, the very, very best of things. Joy in relationships, hope, surprise at people's kindness. But also we know, don't we, the hurt and pain and sorrow and the letdown of relationships, the best of places, but also can be very difficult. And so it's important we look at our relational well-being. And just to kick us off, I want to think, why is it important to invest in relationships? Well, before we do that, a definition of relationships is that relationships, I like this, are a significant connection. Relationships are significant connections. Just a slide up to remind us of that. So we're not just talking about a contact. We all have contacts on our phones, etc. We're not talking about superficial social media friends. We want, don't we, significant relationships. I don't particularly like the phrase. Sometimes when I'm talking to someone, they'll say, oh, let's touch base. I don't want anyone touching my base. I don't want superficial relationships. I want connections, and I'm sure you do. We've been talking as church leaders, as elders. What is it we need to be about? Well, we live in a world of inclusion. We want diversity, and those things are good. But isn't it belonging that's key? Isn't it belonging that we're all after? Deep relationships. And so why invest in relationships? Just some thoughts here for us. Good relationships mirror who God is. They mirror God's nature. Everything that is good in the world reflects him. This is an image here. It's an image of my favorite analogy, actually, of the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. It's an analogy called perichoresis. The word peri meaning around, and the word choresis, from which we get choreography of, it means dance. And what this is saying is this: there is a beautiful dance within the Godhead. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the Trinity flowing together in beautiful, coordinated movement, enjoying perfect, harmonious relationships, the love between the persons of the Godhead. And here's the thing, folks, we're invited into the dance. We're invited into relationship with one another, and it's made possible through relationship with him. So it's worth investing in relationships because good relationships mirror God's nature. But secondly, good relationships are part of life in all their fullness. Next slide, Rich, thanks. Genesis 2 said it's not good for us to be alone. There are to be no Lone Ranger Christians riding into town and riding out again with everyone else saying, so who was that person? We're to be known. and become known. Now, I have to say, avoiding relationships is easier. There's probably less pain, less frustration, but we will miss the deep joy, the surprising kindness, the depth of knowing one another and being known. I love this verse, thanks Rich, from Psalm 68 verse 6, where it says, God sets the lonely in families. He sets us in relationships. We're made for relationship. And it's part then of life in all its fullness. And then thirdly, good relationships will be noticed in a fragmented world. We're not very good, are we, generally as human beings, at relationships outside of God. If we're a Christian, we know God helps us with this. We struggle with relationships with God, with others, and with ourselves. We see relationships fragmenting all over the world. And no wonder then Jesus, thanks Rich, John 13:35 said this, by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. It's the love we have together as Christians that will display to the world that we're followers of Christ and we have him in us and he's helping us with our significant connection. A writer called Alan Kreider, writing about the ancient world, the ancient societies, which were very sensualized, very selfish, sounds a bit like Western individualist society. And what Kreider says is it was the relationships amongst the Christians that grew the church. And he says they grew by fascination. People were just astounded by the love they shared between one another. The Emperor Julian, can you flash up the next slide, please, Rich? The Emperor Julian, who was a pagan, took note of the committed relationships of Christians. And he said this, it is their benevolence to strangers and the pretended holiness of their lives that has done most to increase their atheism. Christians were seen as atheists by the Roman authorities, but they were growing. The impious Galileans support not only their own poor, but ours as well. There was just a care amongst Christians. It was known in the ancient world that very often Christians were the ones that went into plague-ridden cities and loved on the people and connected and got involved and were committed. So good relationships will be noticed in a fragmenting world. So there's good reason why we should sow into relational well-being. But how do we do this? Well, our example, of course, is Jesus. I love this verse, John 1:14. John 1:14 said, the word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. Jesus got involved with men and women, young people. He got real with them. God became real and he did relationships. So how did Jesus do relationships? Well, very briefly. Firstly, he was committed. Thanks, Rich. He was committed. I don't know whether you know, remember this series. This is Jack Bauer from the TV series 24. It was a kind of spy thriller thing that was worked out in real time. So every minute on the show was a minute, supposedly, in real time. And Jack, week by week, saved the world in real time. And so did Jesus. He saved the world. He did relationships in real time. He was committed 24/7 to those around him. I wonder what our experience of relationships has been. I wonder if we've known broken commitments and the hurt and pain of that. The world can be quite a fickle place, can't it? Things are disposable when they no longer work, including relationships. And as this picture of this turtle, I think it's been photoshopped, But the environment is teaching us that disposability comes with a cost. And we see it in the hurt and pain as we dispose of relationships in our society. So folks, we need a world we need Christians who will be committed in relationship. Believe it or not, I used to be younger. And when I was younger, I used to be I like to think anyway, a hip youth worker in London. And whether I was hip or not, I did say this. Do you know, a lot of youth work is just turning up. Families on the estates we worked with just needed us to be there week by week. Your marriage needs you to turn up day by day, hour by hour. Your family life, mum, dad, just needs you to turn up, to be there day by day. And so do our friendships. We've just got to keep turning up in commitment. How else did Jesus do relationships? Well, secondly, he was authentic in his relationships. There was nothing superficial about him. Again, unlike our kind of celebrity culture. And I have to confess, we've succumbed to Strictly and some of the other somewhat superficial TV programs out there. But with Jesus, he was only ever wholly authentic. With Jesus, what you saw was what you got. John 1:14 goes on to say this. After saying he moved into the neighborhood, it said he was the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. You know, Jesus will speak the truth to us, brothers and sisters, but he'll speak it in love and grace. Faithful are the wounds of a friend. Jesus was authentic. And I think our world is crying out for authenticity. And we need a place, don't we, where we can go with our feelings, with our hurt and pain, and offload and be authentic in our brokenness. And we need people around us, and the world needs people around them who will be that safe place. One of the things I think I've been learning in this season is we just need to be present for one another. So Jesus was also authentic. And then finally, Jesus made himself vulnerable. He was vulnerable from birth. 1 John 1 says this: that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at, and our hands have touched. You know, Jesus came and put himself at the mercy of humanity. Disciples gave him man hugs. He blessed children by laying hands on them. He put himself at the mercy of those around him. Control was not his modus operandi. Control destroys relationship, as any of us who've experienced control in relationship know. But Jesus made himself vulnerable. He offered himself. He didn't look to control others. He comes to a rich young ruler and says, give up everything, follow me. He just laid it out before him, and he gave the ruler the choice, and he gives us the choice as to whether to follow him or not. He makes himself vulnerable to us. He engaged emotionally. He wept at the death of Lazarus. He allowed himself to be slandered and abused. I was going to quote at this point Isaiah 53, which I think those of us that know it, it's this passage that speaks of the cross, speaks of Jesus' vulnerability. But it struck me on reading Isaiah 53 that much of Jesus's suffering was due to relationships. His suffering was relational. He was, it says, despised. He was rejected. He was held in low esteem. He was silent before accusation, and he chose to be numbered with us. So we're going to come to communion now. And rather than me just quote it to make the point of how vulnerable Jesus was, let's read it as preparation for communion, speaking as it does of how Jesus offered himself in relationship. And as we read this in a minute, let's be thankful for his willingness to suffer so that we can come into relationship with the Father. Maybe we want to reflect on his humility. You know, we hear a lot about entitlement. Well, it tells us Christ emptied himself. The kenosis of God is emptying. He wasn't about entitlement. Let's ask his forgiveness. And maybe we need to forgive others who've hurt us in relationship. Galatians tells us that if we see a brother or sister caught in sin by our perception, our job isn't to do the devil's work for him and accuse them. Our job is to gently restore. That makes me wince. I don't think I've always been gentle in relationships. And friend, if you've been unfairly treated in relationship, it says of Christ, as a sheep before its shearers, he was silent. He didn't demand his rights. He didn't fight back. Sometimes it's right to confront someone who has treated us unfairly and just speak into that. But sometimes we're to let the Lord vindicate us. I think that's what Jesus was doing when he was silent before his accusers. So let's read these words then of Isaiah 53, shall we? Verses, I think it's 1 to 6, we're actually reading as we come to communion. And then if you want to get these emblems ready, we'll then take communion together. So let's read Isaiah 53. It says, "Who has believed our message? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all."